Hello, my woodworking friends. Today's topic, we're going to talk a little bit about sanding. Uh, if you've been a student of mine in the past, you have heard me say that sanding is probably the most boring, the most tedious part of any woodworking job, but it is also the most important. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how to sand, how to select sandpaper, and get the most out of your project by doing a good job of sanding. Because if you do a great job of sanding, or even a really good job of sanding, you can hide a lot of defects. So maybe you're not the best workman in as far as craftsmanship and design, but if you do a good job of sanding, your finish will turn out very well. Consequently, as well as maybe you are a good person at designing and construction and whatnot, but you just didn't take the time to sand, and it will really show up on your final project. So you talk to any woodworker and they'll tell you the same thing. Sanding is horrible as far as time and how much tedium is involved in it, but it's probably the most important part of the entire project. So how does sandpaper work? Well, sandpaper works by actually scratching the surface of the wood that you're working with. And by scratching it, it will take off a certain amount of material. It will also take off things like defects, other scratches, little pits. It will also take off things like paint, pencil marks, whatever else you have on there. Also planer marks. So if you're taking a brand new piece of lumber from the lumberyard, it will take off those little chatter marks that you find that were left by the planer at the lumberyard. So all that stuff can be removed by sandpaper, and it just does it by a scratching process. So I have this piece of wood that I spent a little bit of time on this morning with. So on the one side you can see that I didn't do any sanding on this side. You can see some of those chatter marks I was talking about with the planer. There's a lot of dirt and whatnot and a little unevenness over here in the cut. And there's a big scratch here at the end. On the other side of this board, I spent a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but I spent a little bit of time sanding that piece of lumber. So you can see how much cleaner it is and how much I have taken off a lot of these defects. And I also left a little bit of the sanding residue on this piece of lumber, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So it removes material by scratching it off, and it will take those pencil marks off there as well as anything else. It really depends upon how much time you want to put in on it. So let's talk about the grits of sandpaper. So when we talk about grits, in probably pre-1960, they used to have a classification just written on the back of the piece of sandpaper. So there would be coarse, and then there'd be medium, and then there'd be fine, and then there'd be very fine, and maybe an extra fine. But that would be printed on the back of the paper. Now we use a numbering system. So in this case, I have a number here of 100, not 3M, but 100. And what that's telling me is when they glued this grit onto this piece of sandpaper with adhesive, the screen that they used to sift it out had 100 openings per square inch. So it let on a pretty good sized particle onto the sandpaper. Taking this 180 grit sandpaper here, there's 180 grit or 180 openings per square inch, so it's a lot smaller of a piece of grit that will fall through and adhere itself to the sandpaper. So this sandpaper is finer than my 100 grit sandpaper. So the logical progression is that you want to start out with the coarse sandpaper first. Go with the 100. That will remove a lot of your heavy defects, your pencil marks, a lot of that stuff that was left by the mill. It will help take that off a lot faster. Sure, I could do it with a 180, but it's going to take me a lot longer time. So once I finish with 100 grit sandpaper, then maybe I want to go with the 180 or maybe 150, whatever I've got laying around or whatever I can buy at the local lumberyard or hardware store. And then after I follow it with 180, maybe I want to go up to maybe say a 200 or 300 would probably be about the max that you would want to use. I do have a piece of 600 grit sandpaper here, and to feel that, it almost feels just like newsprint, like a piece of newspaper. Very, very fine sandpaper, and the only place I would probably use this is after I get done varnishing or putting my finish coats on, just to remove any roughness or defects, really create a nice smooth finish on that. But as far as practicality of actually using this to remove pencil marks, it would take forever and a lot of sheets of sandpaper. Okay, so we talk about the grits. So how do you get let's say I take this larger sheet of sandpaper and I want to put it around a sanding block, and I always recommend using a sanding block to sand wood rather than just using your hand in the back of this, because your hand is going to be curved. You're going to have your fingers are curved, your hand is curved, so you're not going to be able to keep a nice flat finish on that just by using your fingers. So grab yourself a piece of lumber, and now this piece should fit your hand comfortably. You know, you don't want to have such a large piece that you have to extend your hand all the way out to grip it, because that'll produce a lot of fatigue. Also, you don't want a really thin piece, because then again, same thing, it's going to create fatigue. So something that fits your hand comfortably. A lot of times you can just go to your scrap bin and you can find something that will work. So the key to this is I want to make sure that my sandpaper fits on my wood block. I don't have a lot hanging off the two edges, and on the ends I just have enough that I can grip it with my fingers and my thumb. Okay, I don't want to have a lot of extra sandpaper that I'm going to waste, and I don't want to have it so small that I have to get my fingers way down to the bottom of that block in order to hang on to it. So, you know, just wrap it around the front of the edges of your board or edges of your block, and just so you can hang on to it comfortably. So how do you do that? So should I use a scissors, or should I use a utility knife? Nah. Those never work, because one, they will work, but eventually you're going to make those things dull. So the best thing to do, and I'm going to reposition my camera here, is just to take a ruler. So I'm just going to take a ruler. I'm going to grab my sanding block that I'm going to use. I'm going to lay it kind of like that. Give me an idea of how much I want to have. So I've got about 1/2 inch on this side. I'll have about 1/2 inch on this side. And I'm just going to lay my ruler next to that. I'm going to hold the ruler down, and I'm going to tear the sandpaper up and toward that ruler. Now I've got a nice piece of sandpaper now that I can wrap around my block and use it comfortably. If I need to, I can tear off a little bit more so I don't have extras hanging off the edge. I can tear this a little bit off, and I can maybe use that with a smaller block for smaller areas. Or maybe I'm having somebody help me, like one of my grandsons, and he's got smaller hands. Okay, so that's all you have to do. Do not use a knife. Do not use a scissors, because all you're going to do is dull those up. You've got rulers laying all over the shop. You can find one of these. Makes it much easier tearing and for sandpaper. Okay. So again, I've got my wood block. I've got a piece that's comfortable. I've got it wrapped around there. Now the process of sanding. So when you sand a block of wood or any project, you always want to go with the grain on the lumber. Okay, never go across the grain of lumber, because that's going to leave scratches running across the grain of lumber. They're a lot easier to disguise if you're running with the grain of lumber, but once you start going across the grain of lumber, it's going to put a much deeper scratch in there. I've heard that it will take like 10 strokes of sandpaper with the grain of lumber to get off the marks that would be left by going once across the grain of lumber. So I have a little block of wood here to demonstrate that. So this is a piece that I just grabbed out of the scrap bin this morning, and I put a little bit of time on it, not a lot. I just did a little bit of time sanding this thing down, and I put a walnut finish on the top. So I sanded with the grain of lumber, spent a little bit of time, and it turned out pretty nice. If I would have gone with a finer sandpaper and followed my progression, it would probably look even better than that. Now on the other side, here I just went across I first sanded with the grain of lumber, then I went twice across the grain of lumber, and you can see the scratches that are running across this board. So you always want to make sure that you're going with the grain of lumber and never across, so that you can avoid these scratches, because this would, if you put this on your final project and your final finish, it's really going to show a lot. So you want to make sure that you're always going with the grain of lumber. In this case, it's going this way rather than going across the grain of lumber. Okay, you'll get a much better result. You'll be a lot happier with that. Now, as far as sanding itself, you want to try and sand, especially if I've got a lot of small pieces like this, I want to do the bulk of my sanding before I cut these out. Yeah, I'm going to have some tear out with the saw, depends upon how sharp my blade is and whatnot, that I'm going to have to fix, but it's a lot easier to sand a big board and hang on to a big board than it is to try and sand a small block like this at one time. So try to do the bulk of your sanding, take it through your coarse sandpaper and your medium sandpaper on a larger piece, and then you can do your cutting and then touch it up a little bit if you need to. It depends upon how sharp your saw is and what it left behind. Obviously you're going to have to sand the end grain here. I got a little paint from my saw blade here that I'm going to have to get off, but I've got the bulk of this stuff done while the piece is a good size to hang on to. Oh, there's the bell. All right, so just talked about hand sanding. Now let's talk a little bit about machine sanding. I have these random orbital sanders. These are great pieces of equipment. If you're going to buy a sander, this is what to do, the random orbital. What it does is it rotates in around the center of the motor axis, and then it also concentrically vibrates. So what it does is it really reduces swirls, and it will take out material at a fast rate of speed. Okay, I've got these little dust holes here that help. There's a little fan on the side of this thing, but basically the dust is drawn up through there and it's run into my dust bag. So on my sanding disc, I got the same thing. I've got a set of holes. So it makes sense to try and line the holes up with the holes on my pad. And I'll show you how to do that here with moving my camera. See if I can hang on to this at the same time. So usually what I'll do is I'll take this in both hands and I'll have my sander upside down, and I want to get it on one hole on first. So I'm really concentrating on getting it lined up with this hole right here, and then I just let it set down and I just press it on there. Now this is a Velcro or hook and loop, I guess is the technical term, but it doesn't have to be perfect. This is just good. I'm off just a little bit, but this still is going to allow most of my dust to go into my dust bag. And again, when I get done, I just tear this off, or when I'm ready to go to the next grit, I just tear this off and I go to the next grit. So these sanding discs are pretty much just like we talked about before. This is an 80 grit, so it's 80 grit sandpaper. This one happens to be a 120, and then I have 220. And again, you can go to your hardware store, your lumber yard, and you can get a whole bunch of these different type of discs to accomplish whatever you need to accomplish with the sanding. So the other thing that you want to be aware of is that sandpaper wears out. It's just like any cutting utensil. We're actually, we're kind of cutting while we are sanding, so it does get dull. I mean, sandpaper gets dull. When you get to a point where you're using the sandpaper and it just doesn't seem to be doing anything, it's probably a good indicator that it's dull. I have this disc here, which I found in my tool room. I don't know why we're saving this thing, maybe just for this demonstration, but this tells me a couple things. One, we got our money's worth out of this disc, okay? The other thing is this around the edges like this tells me that who is ever using this sander here, or this sanding disc, instead of using the sander nice and flat like this, they were using it on edge, and that was what would cause this type of wear right here, is using a sandpaper like this. So we really ground off the edges, and we probably did some damage to the edges of our hook and loop by doing that. So the key to running these sanders is just let the weight of the sander and the weight of your hand do the work. Because once you really press down on this, and you can hear this thing bog down, what you're doing is you're stopping that rotation, and what you're going to develop is you're going to develop swirl marks in your lumber, and you're also going to develop divots in your lumber and waviness. So you want to let these sanders do their job. They're designed just for the weight of the sander and the weight of your hand. You do not need to press down on these things to get a good result. As a matter of fact, you'll probably be more disappointed with the result when you're pressing down on that. Plus, it's hard on the sander, it's hard on the hook and loop, and these things wear out a lot faster. So if you're going to buy one of these things, buy a good one. I have DeWalt simply because that's what we've got in the shop, but they are a good sander. There are a whole bunch of different varieties and types of sanders out there, but these random orbital sanders, they're excellent for doing woodworking. Okay, so the basics on sanding is, again, start with a coarse sandpaper, work your way to a fine sandpaper. Take your time doing it. It's going to involve some elbow grease, or it's going to involve some work with an electrical sander, but you'll be a lot more pleased with the results. So take your time on sanding. Start with a coarse, work your way through medium up to a fine sandpaper before you do your finish. Before you do your assembly, you want to try and get all your sanding done before assembly. And then once you get assembly, all you got to do is do a little bit of touch-up before you put the finish to it, and I'm sure you'll be happy with the results. So with that concludes our little presentation on sanding, and we hope you come back for another one in the near future.